Welcome everybody to the final verdict of the DEFCON 5 series, a bunch of videos that I cooked up about the City of Heroes on the Homecoming servers, playing on the Excelsior Shard, taking a look at two of the classic supporting archetypes in the game, Defenders and Controllers, DEFCON, and we looked at them from the question or the perspective of which of these two is the superior supporting archetype in your game. So if you had to pick one, because you want to be this badass supporter on the squad, who should you pick? Is there an answer to that question? Is one better, one worse? That's what I set out to answer with this series. And so we put together a whole bunch of videos where I had 5 defenders, 5 controllers, each pair with a common shared support set, such as traps, such as nature affinity, etc. And we ran a series of 5 missions each, compiled all the data, looked at kills, defeats, damage in, damage out, etc., etc., etc. Did a whole bunch of analyses and recorded everything, threw it out there for you all to see, threw in my own commentary along the way, presented all the data, all the statistics, all the numbers, posted that up to the Homecoming forums. Everything's an open book, so you can make up your own mind. And then, of course, I'm going to give you my opinion today, my final judgment, my final verdict. And it's my final verdict. You may come to a different conclusion, of course, but and that's the spoiler of today. There is a conclusion. There is an answer to this question, and we're going to get down to it. I'm gonna show you what I found, and I'm going to explain why I know what I know, what it all means, and really what does it mean. So, without further jibber jabber for me, let's get down to business. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at the overall idea, which I kind of giving you most of it right there. But then I'm going to go back and rehash each of the DEFCON levels, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, who the contenders were, and what the basic findings were along the way. And then we're going to get into the compiled data, the stuff that you really want to know, which is what happens when you take all the data from all those defenders and all the data from all those controllers and put it all together and do the same statistical analyses that you've seen me doing before. Is there some sort of difference? Is there something you can see in the numbers? And what is that you see and what does it mean? Overview. We had 46 paper missions, radio missions and tips, and 3 mayhems and 1 safeguard mission over on the defender side. A total of 337 minutes of playtime. 337 minutes. That's almost 6 hours, everybody. And I averaged with this set of defenders just over 4 teammates. My goal was to have teams of 5, so my character plus 4 guests. But I did have a couple missions where I actually had an extra body on the squad, and go back and take a look at, I think it was in DEFCON 2 that happened, and I give my explanation for what happened there. And then on the other side of the coin, we had the controllers, 47 papers, radios, and tips, and we had 2 mayhems and 2 safeguards over there. Yes, Virginia, there was 1 extra mission. Again, go back, I think it was DEFCON 2 that happened as well, and you can see what the story was behind that. But this is clocked in at 413 minutes. Dang, that's almost 7 hours. So you add that all up, we're looking at 12, 13 hours of play testing. Average teammates on this squad, 3.77, because we did have a couple of dropsies in the middle of one of the runs. That, again, was explained, and we'll get into that a little bit. But most everything I'm going to talk about today, I've already said, at least initially. I've run all the other DEFCONs. I've run all the other data sets. So I'm not going to dive into any specific details on any of that stuff. I'm going to try to keep this general, big picture kind of stuff with this conversation. So if you hear me referencing, hey, go look at this other video, that's because it would take me 50 hours to do this video if I redid every single thing I've said already. But there's the overview of what we're comparing. But we're looking at a total of about 13 hours of total gaming with dozens of different teammates, dozens of different maps, dozens of different factions, everything recorded, everything logged, chatted, you name it. Massive compilation of data, which is one of the reasons why it's taken me so dang long to get this video out, is I've just spent the last 3 days putting this together. And so hopefully this conglomerate of data will sort of put to bed a little bit some of the one of the criticisms, a couple of the criticisms I got on the forums, which was after my initial DEFCON 5 posting, there was some sort of pushback of, well, hey, you can't just compare electric affinity on a defender versus electric affinity on a controller, and your defender was all, endurance drain based, but your controller, they should have had electrical control. And I made the argument back then that it doesn't matter if you gather enough data. I wasn't trying to compare a specific one person here, one person there, and try to answer the question. I'm talking about 50 missions here. I'm talking about 13 hours of gameplay. I'm talking about huge, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lines of log chat code that I've gathered and compiled those data for you. So all of it, when you lump it together, that's where I'm hoping. And I believe I have found an answer. So let me stop babbling. Let's get down to it. What happened? What's going on? Let's go over to DEFCON 5. A little bit of recap on this one. We'll go ahead and set this up for you. All right, so here in DEFCON 5, the first matchup was electrical affinity we're looking at. And I had two characters here, the Live Wire and the Bloom Guard. And spoiler, this was a draw this first round. This was Emperor Avenger, my triple E defender, versus Ostara, a plant electric earth controller. And with Emperor, he played like a living capacitor. He would charge up, discharge, and when it was working, he would just, the idea was he would light up the room with, or light up the mission with all of his powers and buffs and stuff flying. And with Ostara, she wasn't there to try to win a fight directly. She was there to make sure that the fight never turned against you. Just a lot of control and support buffing, kind of standing back, doing her thing. And so my man Avenger here, on paper was kind of a fun, cool concept. I was a little bit disappointed he wasn't able to really do what I thought he could do. I think the team was a little bit shaky. There was my first run, of course, and Ostara similarly. I thought both of them could have done a little bit better. But the big idea here is, his blasts. They were just had a purpose, right? Charge bolts, lightning, you would focus on your lone targets. Ball lightning, you'd be shocking whole clusters of targets. Thunderous blast, right? You were there just to fry the entire board. And that whole set was based upon drain and pain, lowering the endurance, taking advantage of the shock mechanic, and doing more damage. And the electrical mastery was added in there. That rounded him out, gave him some control, gave him some protection. He had Thunderstrike, able to slam into foes, disorient them. Shocking Bolt, stopping people dead who were trying to run away. Power Sink to refill the tank when it was getting empty. And in a fight, he doesn't have toggles, right? He's designed to surge, dive in, pull aggro through the voltage while he's tossing buffs around, buffing his allies. And he performed best when the team was keeping up with him, keeping pace. But I felt he was faltering when he would, not have backup, or, one of his allies would take off in the wrong direction. And when everything was syncing up, damage, the debuffs, the absorbs, the control, he was playing like this overloaded circuit board, bursting, sustaining, scorching a battlefield with all these crackling bolts of energy. But when, there's a mistimed trigger or a bad spacing, that would really short out his circuit. Ostara, on the other hand, she wasn't designed to raise the battlefield. She was this whole idea of cultivating this goddess of spring. And she was just kind of playing more like inevitable creeping of just tentacles and vines and creepers and the buffs and just everything surging forward. And plant control, it's designed just to kind of pin the foes in place. You have the roots, you got spores, you've got your confusion. And electrical affinity then is going to pump everything up with more healing pulses, absorb shields, endurance boosting, and you're wearing down your enemies at the same time with some debuffs, galvanic sentinel, etc. And earth mastery, it's just this, quick heavy or quiet heavy hitter. Seismic smash is blasted in the bosses. Fisher having some crowd control with the knockdowns and disorient possible chances, and rock armor was there for keeping her to in the fight if anything got past all of her controls and buffs and such. But it really wasn't burst damage that made her powerful at all. It was just density. Her damage was coming from everywhere. The creepers, the confused groups, fly trap is throwing out thorns, earth AoEs with fissures slamming into stuff, just disrupting movement. Electrical toggles just humming around constantly. She was very self-sufficient and team friendly. She didn't need attention or babysitting, and you'd forget she was there most of the time, right? You didn't notice her until if you thought about, hey, nothing's hitting me, what's going on, and the entire mob is just being slammed by all the creepers. Survivability stats. This was the how many times you died in your mission. Let me go ahead and move myself over to little more neutral position here. So with the survivability, it's how many times you were defeated. And with this one, there was 3 versus 2. An Emperor, he had a higher rate of 0.041 and a composite of 0.009. The rate is how many times you died per minute, whereas your composite, that was the number of deaths per teammate, rate divided by teammate. And neither one of them, though, had anything, significant, anything crazy out of the ordinary, defeats, that sort of thing that would make you go, oh my gosh, this one's way better. And so the statistical analysis on this showed just that. It was pretty much a tie. There was nothing special. Nobody, you know, did anything crazy. And most of them it was pretty safe overall, 3 versus 2. Then you go over to the risk analysis. This is how many times allies were defeated. Here's where we started to see some shaky numbers. 19 versus 18. Now, this is my first run. So at the time, that seemed like a lot, right? 19 deaths over 5 missions. It's about 4 per mission. 18, same thing over here with the controller. Rate was 0.22 versus 0.23, so very close. Really no difference between the two characters, but that overall number, 19 versus 18, by the time I got done with this, that number is huge because my other defenders were like really nowhere close to this many defeats. And this is why if you've heard me talk about this in some of my other videos I've done on this series, especially in the later DEFCONs, I really am soured on electrical affinity as a support set. It's, from what I can tell, it's terrible. I mean, my own experience with it, the numbers were terrible. At first, when I first started out, I thought it was a very powerful set because you could do all these different ways to buff and had lots of, support kind of options. But in practice on a team, it was just awful. It had the worst numbers for pretty much everything. So anyway, 19 versus 18, but there was no, statistical significance here between these two. So if you kind of look at those first two metrics, these kind of defensive metrics, survivability and the risk, Emperor, he's pushing harder, I felt. Took a lot more risks. He was more aggressive, forward charging, but a little bit fragile. He didn't have much in the way to protect himself. He had to rely upon the bouncing, chaining buffs to hit him. His missions were a bit shorter. He did have an average of, more teammates, but he still took a little bit more hits. So I don't think the pressure wasn't necessarily like he was soft. I think it was more that the way I was playing him, much more aggressive. It was like he was inviting trouble. And Ostara, much cooler play. Her risk was lower. Pace was more methodical. Her team was smaller overall, and she did fall one less time. But I mean, her survivability wasn't perfect, wasn't flawless. But where she didn't have that kind of zip zap that you saw with Emperor, she made that up with just control and smoothness. In the end, though, neither archetype had any edge in the survivability. So it really wasn't how often they got defeated. It was, how they played and when they were able to absorb hits and what role they chose to get things done. That was where things, were different between the two. More of that style, I think. And then as far as the risk here to teammates, again, Emperor, he was charging ahead. Ostara, she was more holding the line, hanging back. But again, indistinguishable as far as the numbers go. 18, 19 defeats across the 5 missions. The stats, the rates, and they were all pretty much identical to each other. And Emperor, he surprisingly delivered steadier results. If you kind of just look at his numbers across the board here, you can see him in the yellow bars. Right? He was 1 and 3 and 1 and 4. I mean, really kind of smooth number of defeats where, we had Ostara was, 1 and 3 and 12 and 1 and 1. So she kind of had this spike. Uh, he had a bit of a spike too, and Perth was on the Mayhem mission, which is just notorious for being rough. Mission 3, though, for Ostara was just like a bloodbath. I'd have to go back and watch that video exactly what happened there, but to have sort of one of the normal, regular, papery tip type missions be a major bloodbath like that, that is sort of the big surprise there. So what exactly happened? What collapsed? Maybe some teammates got out of reach or something like that. But I think when you look at the numbers, the missions, the teams were very safe until they weren't, right? Very safe, very safe. They weren't. They weren't. So it's sort of a hit or miss kind of a thing with those characters. But in the end, it really wasn't recklessness. It wasn't restraint. It was more about consistency. And, again, nobody had a clear edge on superiority. Let me get into some of the offensive stats, the lethality of these two characters, how many foes you're able to drop here. And with Ampere, he brought the voltage, right? He had more kills per minute. You can see 2.8 right here versus the 2.4. Faster tempo. He was more blitz heavy bursting of damage, cracking the front line with his attacks, short circuiting up close. But they weren't decisive numbers. He did have more, actually, he had a little bit fewer raw. Actually, sorry, he did have more raw kills, 207 versus 198. Uh, over 76 minutes versus 84 minutes, but not huge, not breaking the margin of error on that one. So nothing that you can write home. So yeah, he won. Ostara, she didn't match that level, that pace, but she really didn't have to. She was more methodical with the output, consistent, unshaken with the team size change. When she had 4 and only 3, and then over here you got 5 for Ampere when they had the extra bodies here. So it really didn't seem to matter for her that her team was a bit smaller and went down to 3. She just did her business and kept on chugging. And Emperor, he kind of had some spikes and some dips in his, right. So he's sitting here, 4.5 spike, 1.5 dip. Hers was a little bit more consistent, 1.8, 1.5, 2.3. A couple 3 spikes, but nothing as up and down, I don't think, as Emperor's numbers were looking like. You can see that from your graph. But overall, most telling, the composite numbers, which adjust for your team size, they didn't shift like you would expect them to have shifted. That's the lower graph here. So you're thinking, hey, if I got more teammates, I'm gonna be getting lower numbers because I don't have to do as much, or if I have fewer teammates, I'm gonna get higher numbers because I have to do more, etc. But you didn't see those types of shifts. Emperor did have more teammates, but he had a high composite rate, and regardless, suggesting that his output was just scaling with the team. Didn't matter. And that could be because he was getting more endurance drain, which has helped boosting his damage with his electro attacks, possibly. Ostar overall, she had fewer allies, but was able to match that efficiency. She was able to, keep putting out the damage. It didn't matter. So that kind of suggests that maybe she's able to kind of carry herself more, solo more easily than he was. So I don't think it showed necessarily just a shared burden like you might think. It was more just kill independence for her. But overall, I think of Ampere, he was kind of this electrical cannon. Ostar is more like a conductor. He's surging and she's flowing. And both of them were able to drop enemies, and neither one of them jumped out at you statistically. But it was really the feel, the style of how they played. He's attack, buff, and she's, throw out seeds, drop creepers, throw out a buff, throw out some roots. Just kind of more methodical, letting the pets do what they had to do as well. Let's move on to our threat. This is again some more offensive stats here. We're looking at the damage output between these two. And with this one, when it came to his raw damage, they were pretty much dead even again. We're looking at 275,000 versus 268,000. Very close numbers. He was slightly higher, not statistically significant again. He had more damage, more higher rate. His composite was a little bit lower because he did have more teammates. But Ostara, She had more damage per ally. That's because she had fewer allies overall. You can see in the one mission, she's 800s, 800s, 900s, 1100s. The thing that kind of, hurt her is that extra time, So here we're having higher division with the teammates, but shorter time is what's lower in his composites. Her composites are pretty good, you would expect just by the damage, but she had more time as far as the rates kind of slowing things down. So Emperor, what I saw when I looked at the pet numbers is the other big difference. Taking a look here is that uh, Emperor did most of the damage himself. Across his missions, 75% of his damage came from him, from his own powers. The biggest pet contribution was 50%. That was during that mayhem mission, which is probably just because that was a long mission, a lot going on there, more time for the pets to have an impact. But all the other ones, I mean, barely, you know, any damage. There was, some decent output here in mission 2, but sliver of damage in missions 1 and 4. I don't remember if I brought my lore pets out till late on mission 1. This was when I first discovered how damaging the lore pets could be. And I think it was when I was looking at these numbers or just pets in general. So that was something in hindsight I probably could have run the lore pets a little bit more for both the characters. I don't think it was just Emperor, but the pet damage really became telling when I was analyzing this first DEFCON 5. Ostara, on the other hand, she flipped the script on this. Her damage was about 50-50 the whole way through. Her pets were leading in a couple of the missions. Her biggest pet contribution, was what, 65% of her damage, I think it was, on that Mayhem mission, if I'm not mistaken. So, like 2/3 of her damage is coming from pets. Crazy. So she wasn't like the blade, that was cutting. She was the one that's planting the seeds. And so, the pets were just a huge contributor for her. And that's sort of a spoiler, a theme you're going to see throughout these comparisons as we go, defender by defender, controller by controller. But in the end, neither one of these characters outpaced the other one in their threat. Styles, though, that was night and day. Emperor front loaded, doing his own thing. He's ramping with the team synergy. Ostara, she's more battlefield gardener, slow, steady, tending the crop, dangerous over the long season. The longer it got, the more she could do. But no huge difference. Resilience. Now we're getting into some more defense. This is the overall damage you're taking as a character, plus the efficiency, which is the ratio between your output and your input. Emperor, he absorbed more damage, which wasn't surprising just the way he was playing. He took more hits because he was trying to make the plays, and his tempo, getting in there, throwing in buffs, trying to stay close to the front in order to use his short circuit and to buff his melee allies, and then running back to buff range people, etc. That invited threat, and he carried it every fight. Ostara, she was much lighter on her feet. She took fewer hits. She was shown more control. She had a tighter margin, more consistent, not necessarily more durable as you saw from the number of defeats she suffered, but just less exposure overall. In terms of efficiency, she did more value per damage taken, so more out versus in, but the margin again was small. There was no statistical significant difference between the two characters. So, if you look at it from Emperor being like a frontline, cannon, Ostara is like, I don't necessarily say she's a sniper, but she's behind the lines. Both were being effective in what they were doing. Both were resilient in a different way. But final verdict with these two, Sparks versus Spores, who came out on top? Nobody. Statistical tie. 5 missions, 5 metrics, dozens of data points. They had to draw. Every difference, the kills, the damage, survivability, team risk, too small to be conclusive. But stylistically, there was a big difference. That's where the story, I think, is told with these two. Emperor, he's playing like a lightning strike. He's fast, he's volatile, he's explosive. He carried more weight personally than what Emperor did. But he scaled with his team, so the more his team was going, the more he was going, and he was kind of able to flash bright in the chaos of battle. Ostara, she was quiet. She was this creeping kind of storm in the back, kept steady pressure. She spread her power throughout the pets, throughout her allies. She was consistent, whether she was surrounded by her teammates or she was by herself. Neither one of these characters was better than the other one. They just played differently. You know, you got one guy who's lightning on the battlefield, the other one is like shaping the battlefield. And that is the final thought I had with Electrofinity. But we moved on to DEFCON for Nature Affinity. So let's go ahead and dive into this matchup between the Grove and the Gloom. We had Screaming Tree, my Nature Sonic Energy Defender. And then we had Feywode, my Dark Control Nature and Dark Mastery Controller. And for this one, this was the first one where I had a clear winner, and that was the controller. So hey, what happened with Tree? He wasn't designed to be like a frontline guy, right? He is soaring overhead. He's Overwatch. He's like the canopy, the tree. Steady, sheltering, always present. He's spreading his strength, his buffs, like rays of sun coming down through the leaves, where all of his teammates can bask in the warmth. Fey Woe, though, she was darker. She was strange. She was this whispering, fey spirit in the dark woods, this dark bloom rising from the dirt and creeping around. And she didn't shelter you from the darkness, she guided it. So, Tree, high altitude sentinel, he was always hovering, watching. Battlefield presence elevated. Literally, tactically right, he's above the fray. He's circling over the fight. He's sprouting buffs like welcome shade and unleashing sonic force like thunder through the canopy. His nature affinity. He kept the team blooming. He was pulsing heals. He had absorb shields. He had the field-based regeneration, and was scaling with how well he was keeping track of the team and what was going on. Wild growth, burst and resistance, spore cloud, corrosive enzymes, debuffing, eroding the enemy. Sonic attack, that was his force projection. So if there was an enemy pocket of enemy, foes, he could go in there and sonic attack it. Steady ranged attacks, shredded resistance with every hit. He rarely hit any spikes though, and that's kind of just the way he played. But the rhythm was constant. Layer debuffs, pushing back the crowds, tagging groups for allied takedowns. Very good supporting set combination. And his energy mastery, that brought the personal resilience. He had temporary vulnerability, force of nature. He was able to weather pressure if anything came in on him. But his real strength was just kind of keeping distance, maximizing uptime for him and the whole team. He was reactive and responsive. Didn't control the pace, but he watched, he enhanced, he was able to ensure none of the allies went without support, and no enemy would go without being punished. Fei Woe, she didn't lead the charge. She would summon the shadows and mask the charge. She played like this haunted grove was kind of the concept with her. Fear blooming with every step. Shadows stretching over every encounter. And by the time the enemy figured out what's going on, it was too late. She killed him. Dark Control, that was her whispered hex. She had fearsome stare, clouding the mind of the enemies. She had Shadow Field, Heart of Darkness, Paralyzing Motion. Everything she was throwing out from her control sets, lowering the accuracy, right? Their will to hit back. And her shadows didn't just scare, they were just like smothering people. Then you throw Nature Affinity in there, like this lacing fungal growth going through the battlefield, like with quiet strength. Wild growth, wild bash, and they're fortifying the line, like kind of like a barky skin against any sort of enemy, swarm or storm. Spore cloud, corrosive enzymes, softening up enemy's shell before the force would just like eat them all up and consume them. Dark mastery that helped her to deepen her curse. She was able to throw out their umbral torrent. She was able to knock things flying, spreading the panic. Dark blast, you could smother stuff from afar. Soul consumption, she was able to like turn fallen foes into nourishment and let dark photosynthesis do its job. In practice, she's like this ancient thing that's just kind of, you don't expect to find this in the forest, but it's there. And then her pets were striking before the team could really even do anything. She's throwing the haunts in there and that kind of stuff. Her control was suffocating any counterattack with all of the just raw control plus the minus to hit. And by the time anybody noticed, it was quiet and they were all dead. Survivability, 2 defeats for the defender, none for the controller on this one. And which is, pretty interesting because Screaming Tree had shorter missions, and his team size was a little bit larger. Here's where I had some dropsies. I believe this was the run where I couldn't get enough bodies to join, so we ended up stopping the DEFCON here, and then I ran the second round the next day with this different team here. So this was an interesting sort of switch up where, Tree had the same exact team size the whole way through. So despite that, I mean, she had like no defeats during the whole thing. No statistical difference though, but just that clean run from Faye Wode was telling that story, right? That she was a threat to be dealt with. Screaming Tree, he like got defeated twice. Both were in that mayhem mission, so it wasn't like he was a slouch. The mayhems were the most dangerous missions, those safeguards and mayhems. So he was doing great until that very last thing. And I believe this is the one where I got lit up just walking out of the door of the arson without any chance to do anything. I think the PPD just came and just obliterated him as soon as before the animation of the door closing even ended. He was dead. But again, solid record, very durable, very present with the team. Faye Wode, no falls, no defeats, not even when the fight had closed in, untouched. The data does remind you though that perfection on paper doesn't always translate into dominance. So even though she was perfect, she didn't dominate. And so margin, razor thin margin between the two, and only being defeated twice, that wasn't enough to make her, jump ahead of Screaming Tree. Then we're going to move on to Risk. So how about the Allies? Allies, similar story, about the same sort of, ratio here. He had a couple more defeats than what Faye Wode did. The Mayhem mission was the problem over here for her. 3 defeats right there. Wasn't as bad for Tree. He had a pretty big jump in mission 4. I think that might have been was this the one with might have been the morality mission. That was a pretty rough one if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that was the PPD morality mission. So that one got pretty frisky. Mission 4 for him. Lots of stuff scattered. It was kind of like it was pretty much like a safeguard style of mission, outdoorsy, waves of ambushers, that kind of stuff. It's really hard to sort of contain the chaos if you're out on the street fighting. But anyway, with the Risk, Screaming Tree, team took more hits, especially that PPD mission, that morality mission. But across the full arc, numbers didn't deviate again to declare any huge, winner in Risk management. Faye Wode's team was cleaner, fewer allies, fewer defeats, so that was always nice. You have less people, but it also could explain why maybe she did have fewer stuff because she's had less allies to worry about. So it's possible that that helps explain the difference there. I don't know. Then we're going to go ahead and keep talking about, where is it? Let's scoot on to our next stat here. Lethality. We're taking a look at bad guy defeats. So how about this statistic? We had, let's see, 172 versus 349. Here's where a big difference first became evident between these two. So in this one, Faye Wode just, 2-to-1 him on this one. Nearly double the rates, right? 2.6 to 4.2, 0.65 composite, 1.42. So she just had a really high statistical significant edge here in this offensive kill output. She was explosive. Mission 2, Mission 3 outputs were just crazy numbers. If you look at, she had 128 in 18 minutes. I mean, his best was 81 in the Mayhem mission, which was 27 minutes. 70, so almost 200 right here in about the same time as this Mayhem mission. So huge difference here. Especially for a controller, but I think this is, again, sort of where the story starts to be told for controllers. Lots of pet damage was being thrown out by her, her haunts, Umbral Beasts, her lore pets, etc. Screaming Tree, he was playing a long game. kills were going up with mission time, which is what you'd expect. And as buffs were able to start to take hold, and I think that's something you'll see more with these defenders is that as things went longer, their buffs and their support was able to start to take hold and start to add up for them. So that's kind of this long game that he was playing. But Fei Woad, she didn't need the extra time for buffs or what else. She was just calibrated to strike, and not just more often, but just faster. Stuff was just dropping. It wasn't close. I mean, she just brought the sting. Take a look at threat analysis. This is the damage output. You're going to see a very similar story to the number of foe defeats. We've got 306 damage sitting here versus 184. Huge numbers, huge numbers. So even though on a per, what was it, a per, actually, I'm going to retract that. I mean, Fei Woad, I was about to say that Screaming Tree had, his per minute numbers were decent. No, I mean, he got worked here as well. If you take a look, Fei Woad, she wasn't just like haunting. I mean, she was devastating people. 5 missions, she delivered nearly twice that damage. 180 versus 306 there. And twice, statistically huge difference between the two in the rates. Let me just confirm that. All right. Yes, I just double checked his statistics. The statistics on that one showed that there was overlap in the standard error. So it wasn't statistically significant. The rates 22805, 364. So she did outdamage him by a lot, but because of the extra time, it made the rates within the margin of error. But again, that doesn't you know, bode much for what Tree did here. Anyway, but his where he was building his power gradually, the resistance debuffs, stacking AoEs, steady sonic damage. Fei Woad would just come in with force, and the shadows and pets and stuff would just strike early, surging off, and didn't let up. The creepers slamming around. It was a bloodbath. But the Umber Beasts, the Shades, they carried her damage. And some of the missions, they did more than half her total. And so she wasn't casting from the front. It was like she was pulling strings from the gloom in the back. Screaming Tree still mattered. His damage was steady. His support was layered. His positioning was good. But overall threat, she, beat him. But again, it's statistically though, it wasn't beating enough. So take that with a grain of salt. Resilience. This is your damage input. Screaming Tree. He took some hits. I mean, 32,000 versus 16. So, double. Twice the damage. But I think it's because his debuffing and his toggle debuffing, that invited fire. And he was there to take it. He didn't run away. He was hovering overhead, firing away. Fei Woad, on the other hand, I mean, she was able to dance around anything that was coming her way, if it came her way at all, because you had, the creepers were occupying enemies. You had confused enemies. So the incoming damage, definitely was less. And her efficiency ratio was 23-1 in some of her missions. So efficiency, that's where we're taking a look at your output damage versus your input. So she had like a 23-1 ratio. I mean, that's huge amounts of out versus in total data or damage is crazy. And now you can see that in this graph here. Where is it? This one. Yeah, she had look at these are her numbers up here. These dots. Massive numbers. This is versus Tree's numbers down here on those comparable missions. So she was much more efficient in 4 out of the 5, missions if you look at them side by side. Just huge differences between their ratios. At least 3 out of the 5, if not 4 out of the 5 missions. So massive, massive, massive differences there. So huge, advantage going out to just Fei Woad. Not only is she doing a lot of damage, she wasn't taking a lot either. So if you kind of add it all up, It really wasn't a toss up at all, right? I mean, Faye Woad took this one. She didn't just hold her own, she outperformed. Lethal, efficient, overall impact was all statistically higher. Survivability, she was untouched, didn't die. Even though her allies couple deaths, it was pretty clean nonetheless. Screaming Tree wasn't that he did anything wrong, right? I mean, he was very strong, very reliable. I mean, only 2 deaths of his own. His allies died a few times, hardly anything. And probably in any other sort of normal matchup, he might have come out ahead. But Feywo just is too much. Dark Control. Uh, sorry, was I saying plants? I was thinking because she's nature. I was thinking creepers. But creeping as in she's scary. Uh, Dark Control with the haunts. The Umbral Beast. I just her shadows she's throwing out there, all the fear that she's got going, all the debuff she's got going. Then you throw in the nature buffs and debuffs. It just was too much. If you were to pair Dark Control with something more offensive than Nature Affinity, it would be just a bloodbath. But anyway, uh, Nature Affinity shows its range, I think, here. You've got the same, support set. You got two completely different archetypes, two completely different philosophies and playstyles. You got this hovering shield and this creeping shadow, and it works for both of them. It obviously just worked better for the controller on this one. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at DEFCON 3 time manipulations. Our next little matchup here, and this one had our time slinger versus the event horizon. And in this one, we're gonna flip the script because the defender wins this one hands down. Marquitu Tomp, time manipulation, dual pistols, ice mastery, defender versus Budakash, gravity control, time manipulation, energy mastery. He doesn't just race the clock, he resets it. He was playing like precision clockwork debuffers. Every round was a gear, every cast is calibration. He didn't just react to the cast, he was rewinding the clock before it even started. He wasn't built for emergency response. He was built to just erase the emergency from the timeline. Just slowing everything down with time crawl, muffling offensive attacks with his time's juncture, sealing the fate of the enemies with time stops. Foes around him, they were feeling like they were just stretched and sluggish, like kind of wading through molasses. And dual pistols, they weren't just his flavor, right? I used the cryo ammo with him to give them function, chilling the targets down, layering the slows until even a fastest enemy was just unable to move. Suppressive fire, executioner shot. They were carving the space up with a surgical efficiency. And then you throw an ice mastery on top of everything else. Frozen armor helped to keep him untouched. You had Hoarfrost for the health. You had Ice Elemental doing its steady, cold, methodical style. It's damaging as well. He stood up outside of the fray like some sort of duelist. That kind of was the idea from like another era, like a steampunky sort of thing. And just kind of like moseying through the combat with time to spare, no concerns. And the teammates, you never really saw him spike damage, but you noticed just how easy it was for you to win with his buffs and his debuffs. And it's like he was already saw the end of the fight, and it was just taking you there, one pull of the trigger at a time. Budakash, she was similar with the whole slowing ideas, but it wasn't just slowing things down and restraining stuff. She was trying to reshape the battlefield a lot, moving things around, wormhole, etc. She would just play like collapsing inevitability. Foes didn't scatter; they would just spiral. They caught in the rifts, pulled into singularities. They slammed it in by against invisible, forces. She was pulling things from every which way. And gravity's wormhole let her reshape the fight in an instant, just teleporting groups of enemies into the kill box, crushing field pinning them down, gravity distortion field locking them down, singularity beginning the disassembly, just this floating core of pressure and pain. And you combine that with time manipulation, it didn't just slow the enemies, it was warping reality. Farsight was sharpening the team. Temporal mending was healing. Distortion field times juncture, stripping the speed, the power, the focus of enemies. They're helpless early, frozen in mid plan. Energy mastery, you got power boost, let her spike all of her effects, harder hold, stronger debuffs, greater threats. Energy torrent, you flattening enemies down with that. temporary invulnerability that was giving her some, support, self-support, anchoring role, helping her, be kind of tanky. And when she played, she was just radiating disruption. She didn't rush to the front. She pulled the front to her. And the team, I thought, felt the impact and how easy the fights were. Just grabbing stuff and throwing it right in front of them. Enemies, they were realizing just how hard it was to go anywhere and do anything. And she was just kind of controlling like the event horizon, right? Gravity, time, energy, just pulling everything together, erasing any chances for escape. As far as the survivability went, we had no defeats for our defender and only one for our controller. Very strong, equal matchup here. Marquis never touched the floor. 5 missions, always upright. He just stayed far enough from the danger to avoid it altogether. Budakash, she only went down once. Wasn't a trend. It wasn't a concern. It was a fluke. Statistically negligible difference between the two of them. Both extremely durable. Just one at a perfect score. How many allies fell on their watch? It was 4 versus 9. Here we see a little bit of daylight between the two. The risk to allies. Neither one of them, the team didn't fall apart. It was just more consistent deaths with Budakash. Just how they defended was different. Marquis, he had tight control in most of his missions, right? 1 defeat in the first one, and then 3 in the safeguard. That was again sort of that most dangerous mission. 30 minutes on the safeguard. His performance had a little bit of volatility there, but it was definitely recoverable. It wasn't a breakdown during the safeguard. It was just shifting dynamics, because that mission also was when we had a player after we did the bank, the vault. They left. And so we went from 4 to 3, which is a sudden change, because the rest of the safeguard mission is the hard part. So we had, really no choice but to continue at that point, where Budakash was consistent throughout the entire mission set that she did. So despite that, though, Marquis stood tall. Budakash, steadier pressure. Same overall numbers, though. All right, let's take a look at lethality. How many bodies were they dropping? Marquis, he was overall a sharper blade because of the time factor. Even though he did fewer overall defeats, 279 versus 369, his rate 4 versus 2.9 was the big difference there. Clean, fast, lethal. Every minute, every bullet counted. He stacked his debuffs. He froze the targets in time. He dropped them with precision. Budakashi got the job done, but it was a lot slower. Her control-heavy approach, softened the enemies up, but she wasn't the one finishing the targets necessarily. So Marquis, he didn't just hold the line. I think he pushed it. He advanced it. Budakashi maintained control. He was seizing momentum. And in this scenario, our defender was definitely statistically significantly superior here. All right, then we're going to go ahead and take a look at our damage output between the two. So here we go. We've got our threat. Marquis, he was bringing the bullets again with support at the same time where it mattered. He had the drones he had out there were shielding on striking. His ice elemental was ramping up when the fights got longer. But he, like the other defender, was the primary source of damage against. So his pets were only about 20% of his total damage. The rest was him. Laser drone was a big, chunk of that. Shield drone, and so was ice elemental. But Budakash, her numbers were 42%. So not as much damage as we saw with our other controller, but pretty hefty nonetheless. And that was a big chunk of her, so if she could get more pets, Singularity is a good tanky controlling pet, but it's not the uber damager that's out, that you could get. I think, if I'm not mistaken, she has radial on her lore pets, which means one of them doesn't do any damage. But I don't know. I gotta double check that because I do have some stats with damage from it. So I don't know. I gotta double check, but I don't think storm elementals are the big damagey lore pets in the game. They're kind of debuffy and supporting. But overall, his damage output was pretty dang good considering. And he was the first defender I think where I was like purposely said, hey, I need to get more pets. So I think I did a respect with him to go into Ice Mastery prior to this matchup because I wanted to get that Ice Golem and I wanted to try Ice Mastery to get some of the slows and that sort of thing to kind of just go with his theme. But anyway, so Marquis outpaced minute to minute and as well as the composite number. So we go back and look at that. Here again, you can see how the time factor was really the difference here. So he did less damage, but because less time, his rate was much better than what hers was. So we have another statistical difference. He's just faster with his team, and his rate showed it. That was another win for him. Then in the resilience, the defensive category, we've got a statistical tie we're looking at here 367 versus 359 on the rates. Overall, identical, really. Both were equally survivable. So they took about roughly the same hits per minute. Overall outcomes, of course, were different. Budakash, she was soaking more damage. She took 47,000 spread out over the 131 minutes, though, so it wasn't too bad. But she was just kind of tanking and soaking a lot of that damage. Steady, scalable, consistent damage. But it wasn't a waste. She was able to put out efficient amounts of damage as well. You can see that in the little line graphs here. She's putting out down here not huge amounts. You can see Marquis had one really huge spike of out versus in that third mission where he was just, damaging and barely taking anything. So for him, that was his big number. He had a 41-1 kill ratio, I think, on that mission. So this one right here, he did 41 times more damage out than he took in. I forget what that mission was against, but that was the third mission. Real quick, 6 minutes. We just mowed over enemies. Barely took any damage. 532, and meanwhile, I was putting out 21,000, almost 22,000. Huge differences there. All right, and then to kind of wrap up the verdict on that one, Marquis was the winner. So unlike what you saw in DEFCON 5, where it was a tie and where the controller was dominating a bit in DEFCON 4, Defender wins. He had more kills, he did higher damage output, efficiency, threat output, etc., all while he was not taking any defeats. So he wasn't just sitting back defending himself, he was laying down some pain as well. Budakash, she did more overall damage, but it just took her much longer. So was that a team thing? It's hard to say. I have to go back and look at the videos and see why it took twice as long. I don't think that's all, the point at Budakash or anything like that. But she was more playing a heavy lifting, slow controlling, shaping the battlefield type of style, where he was more precise, executing, active, shooting when things needed to be shot, buffing when things needed to be buffing. You know, she was pulling the strings, he was pulling the trigger. And there you go. That's time manipulation. Let's go ahead and take a look at kinetics. DEFCON 2 Chakra versus Demos. Now, this one was the clearest victory of any at this point. Controller, Demos just, it wasn't necessarily a Chakra sucks. Demos was just a freaking monster, a beast. So Chakra, his will is like a tuning fork and his thoughts chain reaction, where Demos, he wasn't just holding the line, he was making the terrain hold it for him. Just both using kind of the speed concept of kinetics, but I think when you look at what Earth Control was bringing to the table combined with kinetics, it was just brutal. So Chakra, he doesn't cast power, he's channeling it, is the way I'm conceiving of him. His presence hums with this like focused intention, weaving like the kinetic flow of energy, psionic clarity, radiant disruption into one continuous pulse. Kinetics is this idea of like his inner will, inner alignments given form, fulcrum shift, transfusion. They're turning enemy weaknesses into shared strength, buffing his allies, but sinking them as well. Speed boost, siphon powers amplifying motion, striking, and willpower. His allies are all becoming part of this psychic waveform that he's putting out. And radiation, that's like his mind's projection, not just damage, but just entropy. And he's firing these beams of energy, X rays, neutron bombs. It's like he's peeling back the layers of reality, and every blast is just eroding structures and coherence and breaking down the foes at atomic levels. And psionics, that's like his calm stillness before his energy storm. And dominate, he's using it to very, I like psionics as it's very controlled. You got dominate and hypnosis, locking in the thoughts of his enemies and just hushing the room with just the psychic weight of it. A mind over body armor set, helping sustain, keep him safe. He felt like his, as a teammate, it was like he was harmonizing everything, right? He was, the moment he was there, things were just clicking, things were going. He was able to uplift actions, accelerate exchanges, bend the team energy towards peak performance. I would love to have the team data for somebody like him to see what that looked like as a side by side with something like Deimos or some of the other characters here. Be interesting to have that data. Deimos, though, he's like this living fault line. His powers, they shape, they break the battlefield, they turn like open ground and like traps, and in contested zones with allies and enemies are just crumbling chokeholds. Earth control was a fulcrum by itself. Stalagmites erupting from the ground, stunning people. Quicksand halting momentum. Volcanic gases just like choking people, sealing them in boiling prisons of toxic gases. Animate stone. Stony was just lumping, brutal juggernaut on the field. With kinetics, he was juiced up and looking to deliver pain. And the kinetics was just boosting him and the team. It was just accelerating the collapse of the enemy. Fulcrum shift was taking the pressure off the team by draining the damage from enemies and just dumping it to the pets, dumping it to his allies. Speed boost, transference. They were reinforcing his controls, keeping his allies moving and hitting. Earth mastery. He had Fissure and Hurl Boulder. Gave some burst damage, gave some knockdown. He had Seismic Smash, had a big old stunning smack. That was brutal. Rock armor, brace of earth, self defenses. And he was just like this magnetic force, just kind of pulling enemies together, locking them down, and just hammering them apart with this seismic power. It was disgusting what he was doing to people. Survivability, 2 to 1. Not a huge deal there. Chakra defeated, twice. Given that he doesn't have much in the way of personal protection, that's pretty damn impressive, actually. And the first mission was a death, and that's usually where I was seeing a lot of deaths, at least with the team, was in that first mission as players trying to get used to each other. And then the end mission, which I think this group was the first and only one I did not run any mayhems or any sort of safeguards. There was a snafu with that, and so I just ended up not running it. But overall, I mean, it was very, very comparable with each other. So, no conclusion to be drawn from that statistic. Then we got into risk. How many of the allies dropped? We have a tie here, 4 and 4, same numbers, same stakes, different teams, identical outcome. Both characters, 4 defeats, small number, spread out pretty evenly. 1 permission for Chakra. Similar idea with Deimos. There was just, 2 in one of the missions. Nobody collapsed. No massive breakdown. So neither character was letting the team down at all here. So both characters holding the line. Risk was low, steady, identical, stalemate team protection. All right, let's move on to lethality. So, how many bad guys did they drop? We have a tie at this point. Here's where things start to differentiate. We've got Chakra, 134, and we've got our friend Deimos with 268, a 2 to 1 ratio. So here's where things aren't close. So Deimos didn't just lead in the total kills, he beat him in the rate, 4.5 to 2.5. He beat him in the composite, 114 versus 0.63. He beat him in the consistency. He was, 4, 5, 5, 3, 5. Here we got 2, 3, 3, 2, 2. Just overall reliable, higher, deadlier beatdown from Deimos. Why? He was operating like a one-man grinder. Earth control, kinetics, earth mastery just gave him tons of battlefield control. He was locking down spawns, debuffing clusters, and just letting his pets pile on a bunch of high, output AoE damage. Uh, his summons, right? All of his pets and his pseudo pets, it wasn't just decoration. These were like engines of destruction. And Chakra, on the other hand, he was self-reliant as usual, with the defender. His radiation blast, his kinetics combo, they focused on personal output, not area denial, not pet synergy. He was efficient, he was surgical, but he lacked that just swarm style pressure that Deimos could bring. So where Chakra was pushing forward, Deimos just collapsed in the battlefield on the enemies. He didn't just defeat them, he just overwhelmed them, devoured them. So when it came to tempo, the controller Deimos, he just made it his domain. It wasn't close. Threat analysis, damage output. As you'd expect, threats favoring Deimos again, not just raw numbers, but how the numbers were made. Chakra again, solo. He is 90% of his threat, of his damage, of that 152,000 came from his own powers, no pets. He generated consistent, but it was capped by just how much he could do by himself. Deimos, he was delegating destruction. His personal damage was pretty good, but his pets, especially Stony, half of his damage was from his damn pets. Is going sick. They were just helping him. They were just executing people out there, and that's just two different philosophies. You got Chakra, hands on. Every kill's coming from his own direct actions. Deimos, he was playing wide. He was setting the field, deploying assets, and letting them just grind down everything on the map. And the numbers reflect that. Deimos out damages Chakra by like 70%. And he's taking fewer hits. He didn't win just by outplaying. He was just a machine that didn't stop. Resilience, incoming damage. Again, we're going to see a pretty big difference. We got a 572 rate for our defender versus a 278 rate for our controller. 2-to-1. Massive difference. So Chakra's taking twice the damage per minute, and he's only doing half of that from the damage output. So his performance, it was pretty bold, trading bursts for spikes and vulnerability, but it kind of, that was it. That's all he could do. Again, I'd love to see the numbers from the teammates. But Deimos, on the other hand, he was just this fortress in motion, right? He low damage in, high damage out, and it just was scaling with time. In a longer mission, he would just do more. And he wasn't just avoiding risk; he was turning it into just payoff. And every time he would take a hit, he'd translate that into several fold in the opposite direction. So overall, in the end, I think we know the verdict is our controller wins this one, giving them 2 wins to the defenders 1 and 1 tie. And it wasn't even close in this one. This was the most lopsided one I saw. Deimos doubling Chakra's kill rate. His damage efficiency 2.5 times higher. Took less damage, dealt more damage. He never was defeated. Chakra wasn't outclassed. He was just outmaneuvered. He had a kinetic play style, personal, up close, direct. He carried his own thread. He was loud about it. Deimos, he didn't play solo. He was a smart pet, controlling synergy, letting all those combinations just carry his weight. reshaping the field, minimal exposure to himself. So while you had Shocker surging, uh, you had Deimos just smurging everything. Uh, you had energy versus mass, I guess might be another way to put it. But that's the way kind of, this kinetics thing worked out. And just as that defender build, he didn't have the same weight that Earth Control did. All right, that takes us to our final DEFCON matchup, DEFCON 1, where we looked at traps. And here, our outcome, and I discussed this in a lot of detail during my reaction video to Vexaris's team missions. Our defenders given the victory on this one. And I'm going to say statistically, it would be a tie. But Vexaris got a DQ in this one, and I go into it in great detail in that video. But for those of you who haven't seen it, just his team composition was, I don't want to say cheating, but it was definitely putting a finger on the scale in his favor. So I think his stats, which are statistically even with Sherry's stats, are obscured by this unfair advantage his team gave him. So that's why my defender was given the victory for this one, because she did the same thing Vexaris did without all the perks and advantages that his team gave him. So we got our Boom Factor versus the Mystical Trickster. With Sherry, I really like this character concept. Talked about it, and you probably can tell. Really into her idea here. But anyway, she isn't just securing the perimeter. She's turning it into a kill box. She plays like this portable kill box, right? She's caltrops throwing them out there, acid mortars bubbling, her drones are screeching overhead, grenades are whistling through the smoke. Every inch of the map she's turning into her own territory. Traps is her trigger-happy toolkit. She doesn't just babysit teammates. That's not what she does at all. She's fortifying the zone. She's got the force field generators, impenetrable shield. She's got poison traps, choking fumes. She's setting this rhythm of survival or failure. And enemies who enter that range, they're already at a disadvantage. Assault rifle, that kind of feeds the inner sadist in her. Bursts are suppressing, slugs are cracking ribs, full autos just mowing down a hallway of the roar. Rhythm, relentless, grenades, flames, buckshots, repeat. She doesn't burst, she just suppresses. And Mace Mastery helps lock that all in. Scorpion shields hardening her line. Web envelope, immobilizing targets. And when everything else fell, if everything else failed, she's got pets with the disruptor, her drones, her lore, or whatever. More bullets, more crossfire, more chaos, just going sick. She's a surgical mayhem mistress. She doesn't really support in the traditional sense. She's just area denial and in sadistic form. She's not contributing. Normally, she's taking over the field, daring the enemies to come near her. And if they do, they don't last long. Vexaris, on the other hand, he's playing like this puppeteer, right? Illusion control, traps, psionic mastery. He's got a stage of lies, and illusions, and detonations, and misdirections. The Phantom Army erupting ghostly doubles, and they're drawing fire and shredding the threats before they realize that they've been tricked. And the spectral terror is sowing dread and minus to hit. And you got Phantasm, throwing out blasts and knocking things flying and its own decoys. And then you think you're like watching a show until like the floor just gives out, is kind of the idea with this guy. And it just turns into a bloodbath at that point. Seeker drones flying around disorienting. The poison trap is strangling people, minus regen. Temporal bomb is unraveling speed, recovery. All these tricks and illusions, distracting, trapping, punishing. Psionic mastery, throw that in there. Mental blast, hitting stragglers. Psionic tornado, throwing people up in the air. Mind over bodies, giving them resilience to stay in the center of the ring. Reality, there's no reality for this guy. What you see is not real. Foes lashing out at illusions. He's priming the detonators while you're confused, and your flanks are undefended. Your allies are charging around and collapsing in the rear, and he's everywhere and nowhere at once. And when the curtain, falls, he's the only one that's left standing on the battlefield. Survivability, no deaths for my defender, and only one for Vexaris. So very, very close between the two of them. This is the first time, I believe, yes, that a controller actually had a faster mission complete time than the defender. So the fact that she had an extra 16 minutes and no deaths at all, that's pretty, in her favor. But statistically, there was no difference between the two, both just ironclad in their job. Then we're going to take a look at the risk. What about their allies? Was there any danger there? Again, very close. We had 4 versus 5 defeats, but again, lower number, more time, leaning towards our defender here. But statistically speaking, with this risk to allies, no difference. A couple stumbles on Sherry's team, no faltering. Vexaris' team, very safe as well. Safeguard a little bit risky, but no major breakdowns for him either. Then we go on to lethality. What about how many foes we're defeating? Here's where things, again, are very tight. We had 206, a little bit higher, versus 200. Statistically, not a huge difference between these two. But again, we have a difference of 16 minutes, which kind of gives this number a little bit of a boost over here. So I think that would kind of leans into your illusion controller being a little more deadly if you look at it from that perspective. If he'd spent another 16 minutes, maybe his rate goes up a little bit more. I don't know. It'd be hard to say. Maybe it goes down. Don't know. But lethality, no major differences here. Possibly Vexaris is a little bit better. Don't know. All right, let's continue. Now we're going to go on to the threat. This is the damage output. Here's where things look a little bit leaning towards our illusion controller. If we take a look at his threat, Vexaris is out damaging with all of his pets that he was throwing out there. 235, 236 versus 189, 190,000. So rates 4318 versus 2555. Our controller's definitely putting out a significantly higher amount of damage with all of his pets that he was throwing out there. Illusions, the phantoms, the spectral chaos. It's ripping through the foes. Half his damage is coming from his pets. You can see that with this the graph here. Vexaris' pet damage over 60%, over 40%, over 40%, about 40%, over 50%. So overall, he's putting out a ton of pet damage. Meanwhile, by the way, Phantom Army outscored, I think, her entire number of pets if you looked at the raw damage numbers. So Phantom Army is definitely putting out a bunch of damage. But Sherry, she was, putting on pressure. She wasn't panicking. Her traps were out there stalling enemies. Her rifle is pumping bullets, striking enemies down. Her pets were playing more of a support role rather than sort of the lead guitar. The Arachnos allies that she was able to summon with her lore pets, their precision tools, they weren't these devastating engines of destruction like you see with the illusion pets. So overall, she held her own even though he had all these extra pets. All right, resilience. How do they take a hit? Here's where the pendulum is going to swing in the other direction. Sherry, she's staying cool under fire. Her mitigation was elite level. Positioning was great. Low incoming damage. It wasn't just lucky numbers or misses. It was tactical advantages. Vexaris, he took a lot more heavy hits, especially missions 3 and 4. If you look at some of his numbers here, he's taken some decent chunks. Over 3,000 damage in 6 minutes at 560 a clip, 970 clip. I mean, her highest was 467. He had 3 missions that were outdoing that per minute. So her statistically significant defense was the story with this lineup here. I think Sherry, she was deflecting where Vexaris was trying to misdirect. Both pretty efficient, but you have things get past the fake pets and come after your illusionist. He's got what else does he really have at that point? But because his damage output was so high, their ratios, their efficiencies were pretty tight here. But she was definitely a superior defensive player. So you kind of look at the two of them; they're kind of yin and yang, contrast with each other. But like I said, at the end of the day, I have to lean this one. When we look at Shrapnel versus Shadows, it's got to go to Sherry. Vexaris, yeah, he was more offensive with all his pets. He did take out more enemies, faster. The pets were a definite difference, but he didn't act on his own. I talked about this in a lot of detail in the review video that I did. He had a Soldier of Arachnos on his team that was stacking leadership buffs. There was a Dominator on his team that was throwing out extra pets and controls that were boosting his own containment values. And then the big difference, you had a Sentinel on his team that was throwing out AoE heals, not just for his own self-protection, but for the whole team. And also had a single target heal that was used on Vexaris and several of the other teammates and keeping them alive. So that wasn't synergy from his sets. That was scaffolding from the teammate. And I didn't have that with any of my other 9 contestants as you go down the list. Yes, there was some other leadership buffs out there. Yes, there was even some healing out there from a Peacebringer, for instance. Yeah, there are other Dominators, but there was never all those on the same team together. So it really pushed survivability for Vexaris unfairly low or high. It depends on how you look at it. He probably should have taken more damage. He probably should have died. His allies probably should have died more. But he had a lot of extra support. He probably would have done less damage on top of all that. So if you factor that in, Cherie, she didn't have any heals. She didn't have outside control. She didn't have a bunch of stack buffs coming from her teammates. She just had her rifle, her traps, and her instincts. Defensively, she was superior, even with the advantages that Vexaris had. Never fell, took less damage, matched his damage efficiency, and she earned every stat without the support network that Vexaris had. So, Vexaris, he was a showstopper, but he had a full production crew. Sherry, she was a demolitionist, solo, stable, always under control. So, in a vacuum, her performance was just better. It was purer. So that's why I gave her the win. So at this point, we have really a tie. And I know it sounds like a cheesy setup. Hey, we got 2 defender wins, 2 controller wins, and 1 actual tie. So where do we land on the final judgment? And that is where we're going to go next, is taking a look at all of these numbers from our bulwark defenders and our binder controllers. And we're going to look at all these juicy numbers, you guys. We've got electrical, nature, time, kinetics, and traps. And we have compiled all of those 50 missions, 51 missions, 25 over here on the defender side, 26 on the controller side. We're going to look at those 6 hours of time from the defenders. We're going to look at the 7 hours of time from our controllers, and we're going to crunch all that juicy data, not just survivability, but all the other stats that I've been talking about so far. And we're going to deliver a final verdict, a final judgment about who is the better, superior support archetype in the City of Heroes game on the Homecoming servers. But we're not going to do it today because, dang, I've just been talking for an hour and 20 minutes just recapping the 5 DEFCONs. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this into 2 parts. So if you've enjoyed the first part here, tune in another couple days when I deliver part 2. In the meantime, go back and check out some of the other vids if you missed any of the action, trying to figure out what all happened in some of these videos I've been referencing. Go ahead and like and subscribe and go to the channel. Check out the playlist. I got lots of stuff that you can go look at. But there you go. I appreciate you all hanging in here for this conversation. And I promise this is not going to disappoint you at all, because despite what we've looked at so far, there is an answer. There is a final conclusion. It's not going to be, well, kind of, sort of, maybe. There is an answer, but I'm not going to spoil what it is. I'm just going to tease you with that. So have yourselves a good one. We'll catch you in the next video. The final conclusion, part 2 to the judgment on DEFCON 5. Take it easy.